Good afternoon. I am Robert Foster. I am here as Vice Chairman of Business for the Arts and as Chair of Civic Theatres Toronto, which is the theatres owned by the City of Toronto, which includes the Sony Centre, St. Lawrence, North York. So far, I have to say, this has been an amazing summit. And we've got a huge turnout. It's a great social exchange that's going on, and we're very, very impressed, Madam President. The topic now is social impact giving. And I might say we have a couple of the major givers in our country here. The banks have a budget of about $100 million each. So having the TD and the Royal is a great opportunity for us to help understand social giving and what that means. And I'm hopeful that you will define social impact giving or a CSR to all of us, because I know everybody has a different view of this issue. You know, there was a book that came out quite recently by someone named David Callahan called The Givers: Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. And this is a look at the elite philanthropists in the United States who are giving away hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And it's a very fascinating perspective on how they view corporate social responsibility and the way they are using their wealth. The banks and other donors, such as Franklin Templeton, and I really think, Sandy, your organization is a think tank. I know it's probably a lot more than that, but the work that comes out is always so stimulating and really world class. So anyhow, my job is to introduce our four guests. Valerie Chort is from the Royal Bank. She's VP Corporate Citizenship. She, interestingly, has a background in science and engineering, moved on to the environment, which isn't too surprising, to global corporate citizenship strategy. And so she really, I think of her as a strategist who has the opportunity to execute those things in which she believes and she's persuaded the bank to follow. We have, let's go to Naki Osutei. Naki is with the TD Bank, Director, Partnerships and Engagement. The TD Bank has just come out with something called the Ready Commitment, which I commend to you. It sets out in very clear fashion the direction in which the bank is now going as a significant contributor to our society. Naki is concerned with global corporate citizenship and carries a lot of personal experience with another bank, Human Resources, Pan Am Games, and Civic Action and numerous other boards. Duane Green, the most important thing for me is that he has just recently joined the Board of Business for the Arts. He did so, I might say, at the same time with a very substantial amount of support. So, Duane, thank you. We appreciate both you coming to the board and bringing your wallet with you. I might say that Duane is President and CEO of Franklin Templeton. If he does his job well, he'll create a lot of wealth for people that they can then give to us. Finally, Sandy Houston, a lawyer by training, who, like many lawyers, you know, they practice their art, and then they say, enough, I want to move on. And he indeed has moved on. Now heads the Metcalf Foundation. And as I indicated, to me, I think of it as a world-class think tank. They're doing a superb job in stimulating thought and discussing issues. Sandy, in addition, has played a role as a founder of a number of community-based, broadly based organizations. And so I'd like to just say it's a privilege to have all of you here. I look forward to your comments. We'll see you a little later.
Terrific. Thank you, Robert. So It is fabulous to have you all here. I know how busy you are, and to come out to Banff is really a treat for us, and I hope equally a treat for you because we've got great weather. So it's a very good time to have this discussion because, as you heard from the Culture Tech study today, we interviewed over 6,000 Canadians in this country. And we asked them, what motivates you to give to the arts? And they said the number one thing that is of most importance to them is social impact. And so we just had a panel on philanthropy, where we had philanthropists come on to the stage to talk about their notion of social impact, what that means for the arts, what that means for in terms of what they do. And I thought to open this conversation, I would just ask each of you, obviously very involved in philanthropy and thinking about philanthropy strategically. One, how you think about social impact, and two, how important is social impact when you think about giving in the arts in particular. So not to put you on the spot, but Sandy, I'm looking at you because we do all read the prolific research that comes out of your foundation at the Metcalf Foundation. And so really interesting work and thoughtful work has been done on this topic. So that maybe you could kick things off, and we'll go from there.
Okay. I found this morning fascinating on multiple levels, and I was surprised by that statistic about social impact, partly because I'm not sure I know what it means. And I wonder, for the people who filled out that survey, whether the answers that they were filling in amounted to something called social impact at the end of the day. That's probably a discussion for another day. But at our foundation, all foundations are concerned with impact. And the vast majority of impact is going to be social, given the context in which we're all working. When we think about our arts work, which is about 1/3 of what we do, so we're a private foundation, and we have 3 fundamental areas of interest. One is the arts, another is the environment, and the third is around social inclusion and social equity. And most of it's based in the city. And we affect the city of Toronto. And we effectively think of those 3 areas that we work on as sort of 3 legs of a stool for a successful place or a successful society. So broadly put, we would say that our involvement in arts and culture is absolutely about social impact. But what we don't try to do in that work is try to reduce it to a set of social outcomes. So rather we say, if this place is going to be successful, we absolutely have to have a thriving, creative, inclusive arts ecosystem. How can we as a foundation contribute to that? And then our strategies come in at the level of investing in organizational success, transformation, human development, how you come into the arts world, how you sustain yourself there, how we build leadership, connections, networks, learning opportunities. So most of our work sort of sits almost in an a priori space, which is we need these organizations, we need arts and culture. How can one organization bring its resources to bear in making that as successful as possible?
So in terms of the human resource development, the people resource development, there are a lot of Metcalf fellows that have come through your organization, and they've done some really wonderful work. I think investing in people is so important, and we see RBC doing that in spades with the focus on the emerging artists portfolio, which has been running for quite a long time. So it's a similar question to you. So is social impact a prime motivator for the foundation right now?
So just let me just provide a bit of context for the question, and I would say that as being responsible for the investment, I'll use that word carefully, the investment of the funds that we have, and we have the privilege of donating. We are being asked by our shareholders, by our group executives, by our board of directors, what are we getting for? What is the impact that we are making or achieving for the investment of $100 million per year in Canadian society? And so that we feel and we have to report on these things in a very similar way. That has forced us to actually do a lot of soul searching with respect to what is it that we want to do, be known for. And about 2 years ago, we undertook a significant review of our broader corporate citizenship program. And it was interesting because part of that involved engagement with many broader stakeholders. And we asked the question, you know, RBC is one of the largest corporate funders, as is TD. What does RBC stand for? And people didn't really know what we stood for. We just stood for being a large corporate funder. And so that we posed the question: Is that right? Is that a good thing? Should we be looking at doing things in a bit of a different way? So following that was really the revolution that in order for us to have meaningful impact, we needed to focus. And through that process, it became clear that we needed to declare what did we want to achieve. So if you look at where do we land, so for now we have, of our $100 million a year, we've declared that 50% of it, so $50 million per year, will go into preparing young people for the future of work, anchored around three major priorities being skills development, networks, and also solving the no job, no experience cycle. So when we talk about social impact in that area, we're pretty clear in terms of the impact that we're looking to achieve in terms of preparing young people for the future of work. We've done the same in arts as well, where arts, we've been very declarative. What we're interested in is bridging the emerging artists from being emerging to established. We did a lot of research with many people that are perhaps in the room back in 2014. We're revisiting it again this year in terms of what are the root cause elements in terms of an emerging artist going from emerging to established. Interestingly, the three things that I've just talked about for preparing young people for the future of work are not all that dissimilar in terms of having an emerging artist become established. And so it's actually, what are the skills? How do you actually, what's the role of mentorship? We're increasingly going to be extending it to networks, the importance of networks in terms of becoming established. But ultimately, what are the actual opportunities of being performing on a stage? So ultimately, we are very declarative in terms of the social impact, again, that we're looking to achieve. And through that focus, are able to not only bring the philanthropic dollars to the equation, but much more importantly, bring the rest of the power of RBC to the issue. So we can bring or RBC economics on the future of work. We can look at engaging some of our leaders on boards and so forth. So by virtue of focus, you can actually bring much more of a comprehensive approach to the issue, and then you can also engage and co-create in a very different way. So for us, it's helped us focus. It's helped us have different discussions with our partners, but ultimately help our partners also understand what is it that we are doing and what we're not doing, so that it's much more effective, I think, for everyone.
No, it's fabulous. It's fabulous to have that support for the sector, truly. Naki, so TD has just embarked on a new strategy, which you've unveiled, and it would be great, and obviously social impact is a big part of it, and I just thought maybe you'd like to talk about that and the importance of social impact in terms of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Robert was so kind to reference the Ready commitment earlier, and I'll take a couple minutes just to talk about what that is, and then talk a little bit about how important social impact has been in the development of this new platform. So the Ready commitment is our new corporate citizenship platform, and I think one of the key differences that this platform has as it relates to what we have been doing previously is that it takes our work from being in a silo where we were working as community relations and really focused on our corporate philanthropy and the impact that our dollars make, to now an enterprise-wide approach as a corporate citizen. So it's about our corporate philanthropy, yes, our dollars, but also the weight of our business decisions and the impact that our employees can have. So similar to what Valerie was talking about with respect to executives on boards, that's certainly an area that we want to focus in on as well, but also how we can engage our employees as volunteers in relation to the kinds of community investments that we're making. So taken together the time of our employees, the talents of our employees as well, the kinds of business decisions we're making, and also our treasure, so our corporate philanthropy. Together, that becomes our platform. And I would say, in getting to that, social impact was really important. Similar to, again, to Valerie's earlier remarks, our shareholders were asking questions about what impact are we making with these investments. Our employees are asking the same questions. And when we took on the task of really looking at how we wanted to shift our corporate citizenship approach, we went out and we asked people, what is TD known for? What kind of space should we be playing in? And people almost to a person said inclusion is the space that they want to see TD playing, and that's certainly the place that we have played in. But if you think of inclusion, what does that even mean? It's a huge term, and if I asked every person in the room to define it, there would be as many answers. And so we took a look also at the macro trends that were impacting inclusion. And I think this was a really important step to take in our process, because I think as Canadians, we talk about inclusion as just a given state, but we don't talk about what actually inhibits inclusion. And so we went into an exercise where we talked about, at a macro level, there are trends, things like, growing social polarization, income inequality, democratization, digitization, the advent of AI, climate change. All of these are trends that have an impact on inclusion. And so if we want to support people to feel confident about their place in the world, especially in this changing world, how could we as a bank have an impact in that, on that through our corporate citizenship? And we landed on 4 areas. One being very naturally financial security. So we are committed to investing in programs and supports that enable people to feel more financially secure. Number 2 being better health. So investing in innovations and programs that improve, that provide more equitable health outcomes. Number 3 being a vibrant planet. So retaining our focus on the environment and investing in the transition to a low carbon economy. And the last area is connected communities. And I think that's the most directly relevant to the discussion today and really aligns to what we heard in the survey results this morning. 1 in 3 people, according to the research that we undertook, 1 in 3 people do not feel included in their communities. And if we take a look at this room, 1/3 of us don't feel like we're included in our communities. And so if we think about how we as a bank can contribute to that, we can do that through the arts. And in my particular portfolio, my area of focus is on employee engagement, but among the levers we have for that are our investments in the arts, both from the perspective of our corporate art collection, as well as our relationship with art institutions. And so from a corporate art collection perspective, we thought, how can we leverage our collecting to actually support this drive to a more inclusive tomorrow? When we first looked, and one of the things that I want to add around social impact, I think one of the really important exercises that we took was really doing an honest assessment of where we are currently. So looking at our corporate collection, we saw that over 90% of the artists represented in our collection are white and male. And that takes into account our Inuit art collection, which we've been collecting for 50 years. And so when we took a look at that, we thought, well, if we really want this canon to reflect Canada today, we need to really start to diversify that. The second area of opportunity for us is in leveraging our relationships both with art institutions, but also with other institutions like post-secondary institutions, to really think about how we can support the pipelining of art leadership. And so that's a big area of focus that we are looking at through our Ready commitment, and in particular this Connected Communities driver that I can get into through some of the other questions.
Oh, I think that's very interesting, the Connected Communities piece. I mean, as you say, Canadians, when we asked, why do you go to the arts? They said, one, they're driven, they want to have fun. And then we unpack that further, but they want to have fun. Then they said, they're driven to the arts for that sense of belonging, of the social, the lively, the interactive, all of these adjectives that are coming out. And it was interesting, there's the New York Times article that sort of went viral earlier this year that they've now introduced the new Minister of Loneliness in the UK. And they say that I think the feeling of loneliness is almost as bad as having 15 cigarettes a day. So it's a real problem. It's a serious problem. There's a lot of joking about it, but it's a serious problem. So I think, to your research, people feeling, 1 out of 3 people feeling that they just aren't part of communities and how it is devastating. And what Culture Chat Canada, our study, is showing is that the arts bring that sense of community. It is our new church, I guess. And so my question to you, Duane, as CEO of Franklin Templeton, and also as an individual who has been incredibly involved in the arts as a board director for the National Ballet School, a director of arts, and thinking more broadly in terms of who you connect with from the business community. Do you feel that if the arts sector, do you feel the arts sector does a good job of telling our story of social impact, if it's framed in this way of we provide a sense of belonging for Canadians? Do you hear that message? And second, if we were to tell that message, do you think it would resonate with the business community, again, at large, thinking at large?
So this is my first Canadian Arts Summit, and I have to tell you, I'm absolutely blown away. This is just a phenomenal, so congratulations to you and the whole team and to everyone in the room. I've just thoroughly enjoyed this morning, but maybe to Sandy's comment about the definition of social impact. Frankly, I think it's a very elegant way to frame the conversation, and it's a good way to get it going. But of course, being a male, and when Nichole called me up, and we had a call 2 weeks ago, and she said, we're going to focus on social impact, I didn't have the nerve to say, well, what do you mean by social impact? What is social impact? So I studiously went about trying to figure out social impact, and maybe got an advanced copy of what we saw this morning so I could kind of put the dots together. But no, I think it speaks to what everybody's saying here, and we're coming at it from a bit of a different perspective, say relative to the banks, and that I guess the way we got involved is that as an organization we're involved, and we want our employees to be involved in a number of philanthropic endeavors, and whether it's volunteering their time or their money or corporately matching gifts and that sort of thing, it's volunteerism, and we call those our involved impact days, and so it's very important to us as an organization. We do this globally. So as an organization, in Canada, we're a U.S.-based investment money management firm or asset manager. In Canada, we manage about $45 billion on behalf of Canadian investors, both in our retail mutual funds, but also for institutions. So, endowments, pension plans, and foundations. And so we're fortunate enough to have a number of arts organizations that are clients of ours that have entrusted us with part of their foundation or their endowment money or their pension plan money. And so that was really our way of getting involved. And so I think in looking at, how we can further it, and so we are not in a position where we've got, say, the large budget to put out there and then start framing it out. I'm absolutely amazed in listening, to the banks in terms of how they're approaching this, and I think it's fascinating. We look at it, and I guess it's more of, and I think that's what probably what brought us together, Nichole, was looking for a way of how can we get involved as a business to support the arts organizations instead of, say, trying to, pick just one. Without having that budget to go as broadly as, say, some others would, we found a natural home with Business for the Arts, and we joined Business for the Arts as a member organization, and which has allowed us now to explore other ways and be exposed to other types of organizations and ways of giving. To your question of, I think there's always going to be that challenge of how to make that conversation relevant to the business community. I'm sitting up here without an ounce of artistic capability or talent in my body. So I'm coming at it. In fact, I have to be, again, another full disclosure moment here. I did go up to Catherine Gregor, who I got to know very well when I was on the board at the National Ballet School, and I said, okay, I need you to translate some of the terminology I heard out of the sessions this morning, because, again, it didn't resonate fully with me, which maybe then is going along to your question in terms of how do we translate the needs of arts organizations into language that businesses can understand to then make that connection to invest. Because it's not just about, sure, everyone needs financial support, and we know that the arts needs financial support, but I think we need to do, we need to all figure out a better way to frame that conversation so that individuals at various, business entities can go internally to tell the story, to then get everyone around the table to go, okay, I get it. I mean, I guarantee you put a bunch of business executives in the room this morning and for these 3 days, they're all going to walk away with a totally different perspective probably than what they thought they were coming into. So I think if we can package that messaging to then get out to the broader business community, that's where I think you can bridge that gap a little bit more.
Interesting. Well, it was very telling that 47% of culture goers in Canada said that they give en masse to the nonprofit sector in general, but then only 5% give to the arts. So I think clearly, and if they're motivated by what they say is, they're motivated to give by social impact in terms of a cause being transformed with a cause, or wanting to give to community, there's something in our lack of ability to communicate the reason, our value proposition for investing in the arts. A couple of interesting things came out when we asked why, why don't you give to the arts? One was the belief that government takes care of the arts, and we all know that that is not the case. And earned revenue in private sector philanthropy and sponsorship is absolutely vital. We need everybody at the table, absolutely vital. The second was this notion of wanting to give back to community, and the priorities are health, poverty, and children. So then the question ensues, if going to the arts has an impact on health, in the sense that it gives you that feeling of belonging, it's an antidote to the loneliness factor, should we as a sector start exploring the various ways in which we touch the lives of children? Obviously, we do have an impact on health. We can alleviate poverty, or we can provide access to those who are living in disadvantaged areas, like the Arts Access Fund that I'm involved with. Do you think there's merit in exploring that line of thinking? And I'm looking at Sandy again to think about.
I'm not sure what my answer to that would be. I mean, if you stand back and look at what impels people to give, it's not surprising to see that poverty and health and education are at the top. I mean, on the level of sort of urgency and fundamental human needs, that makes total sense. And culture does not have an urgency framework the way poverty does. So on that level, I think, culture is probably unwise to say we need to be in the space with poverty. But maybe culture needs to do a better job of trying to broaden, I think is what you're probably asking me, broaden the case and think about whether it fits in some larger framework. And of course it does. And I think the difficulty has been over the years, we've tried to fit it into some awkward boxes. There were the years of making the economic argument for culture, which wasn't terribly successful. And I'm not sure we're wise to look for a new box. But if we can find a frame that's broad enough and inclusive enough and real enough to what culture and arts are actually doing in the world, then I think it makes sense. So one of the frameworks that's out there right now that could be promising is something like a well-being framework, which a lot of people are increasingly interested in. It relates to some of the mega frameworks that the United Nations is using around sustainable development goals. Those are big frameworks. But I think there is an interest on a number of levels in trying to build big inclusive frames in which human activity and human success can be understood in some way. And culture certainly sits in there. And maybe we should be thinking, if this is necessary for donor motivation, and I'm not sure these things are or not, but if they are, then maybe we should be thinking about trying to move some of those implications into some of those broad inclusive frameworks in which a very real case can be made for culture, both at the intrinsic and the instrumental level, in a way that doesn't ask us to contort in ways that really don't represent the reality of what culture is doing.
Valerie, what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't think the arts sector is unique, right? So whether it be another unfunded sector is the environment. Environment in terms of the bucket that you would have heard doesn't necessarily show up. I think it's between 4 to 7% of the dollars go into the environment. So again, what about innovation? So we get asked to invest in a number of these areas, and so I wouldn't view the arts as this way, right? As a sector in which to invest, but I would reframe it as what does the arts? I mean, the arts again, like it's a big aggregator for much of what's under the arts, and I think that definition of what is in the arts and what isn't also is changing. But viewing it much more from a horizontal basis and get to know who you're asking for in terms of funding, right, or co-creation, and then looking at how will you add the value, how will you contribute to that mission or what the intent is going to be. So if we're looking at we're going to unlock the potential of young people and helping them develop for the get ready for the future of work, that's driving Canada's prosperity. Well, how are the arts contributing to that specific mandate? But I think that's going to be really important because ultimately to try to look at the aggregated view of the world of the value of culture is it is difficult, and you can get lost in that argument or that evidence base because it doesn't become relevant to who is actually looking at the table. So know your funder, know what they're looking to achieve, co-create, and then from there jointly look at the impact that you're looking to achieve. So I think that would be the advice that I would see in this specific area. Just like when we get asked to invest in innovation or artificial intelligence and so on, what does that actually mean, investing in innovation? It has to be relevant to what we're looking to achieve as well.
Interesting. Naki, your thoughts?
I would say that if I take the Ready Commitment as an example, we have identified these 4 areas, and we reference them as 4 interconnected drivers of change. And so, against the challenge of inclusion in a changing world, we have positioned ourselves as being able to open doors to an inclusive tomorrow through these 4 interconnected drivers of change. So we know that financial security, connected communities, better health, and vibrant planet, they all contribute together. And I would say the same can be true of the arts. And I think that there's probably a task to be done, and I don't think that it will be the same exercise for every arts organization. But I think there's a task to be done to say, what social issue can my particular arts organization contribute to? And then positioning the work of that organization as one of those drivers of change in support of that particular problem. I think that could be another way of framing the opportunity for social impact in a way that isn't too dissimilar to what you were describing, Sandy, around this wellness index, wellness framework. But I think there's an opportunity to see the arts as one of these drivers that can work together across industry, across sector, across a number of different areas in support of a particular question.
So the notion of artistic excellence came up in the last panel. So how do you, the intrinsic value of the arts? So how do you avoid arts organizations bending themselves into a pretzel to sort of fit a social mandate if that isn't ultimately what it is that they do? And we tackled the art form of opera, just because we like to pick on opera today. And because it's just, if I'm Alexander Neef, it's about excellence on stage. But, and we had 2 members of the board from the opera company, they do a lot of community engagement work. They bring in schools. They bring the opera to other regions. They are actively engaged in community engagement, and they're transforming their Front Street hub into more of a community grassroots hub. So, in some cases, the arts organizations, have started to diversify their offering to allow for more of that social impact and in acknowledgement of that. But that's always the, frankly, speaking honestly, there are only 6 huge funders in the arts from the corporate side. And it's so vital as an investment to the arts sector. So the danger is that arts organizations start to create things that sort of fit the mold. And but when I listen to you and how thoughtful the investment strategies are, you do allow for that flexibility. You are looking to empower arts organizations in what they do in terms of their people and that sort of thing. Duane, so in terms of the social impact strategy that arts organizations could look at, is this an area where you would see your company being more involved, or would you say that the marketing and business development side of investing in the arts is key as well for companies? So I'm just thinking of Alma, that wonderful, she's I think our next Mozart in Canada, and she took the stage, she wrote an opera at the age of 5. So if funding that performance or that fabulous Olympian of the arts does not fit part of a social impact mandate per se, do then companies then look at this as a sponsorable opportunity or marketing opportunity? Does it to sort of live somewhere else in the corporate world? And is that something that you would think about?
Yeah, and I don't think it has to be an either or. I think it can be, then they don't have to be mutually exclusive of each other. I think you can really look at it. If there's burgeoning talent there, why wouldn't we want to support that and figure out a way to develop that talent? I guess I go back to my time with the National Ballet School, and I look at the kids that were going to that school, and there's the stereotype out there, before you even get exposed to any of these organizations, you're exposed to the stereotypes, and you think, okay, the school is a rich kid's school, until you realize that all of those kids are there because of talent and talent alone. And then, of course, because of taking that mandate, it's really one of those situations whereby, not all of those families have the ability to pay for those students to be there. So there needs to be funds to bring that talent along and nurture it. And I remember, going back when I first got on the board of the National Ballet School, they had a dinner. And they had some of the students at the table, and it was just fascinating. And so Liam Redhead was the student that was at my table, and I don't know whether any of you are familiar or remember Liam Redhead. Liam Redhead is an African Canadian man, but he was a young kid at the time at the ballet school from North Bay, Ontario, that now is a superstar ballet dancer, and he starred on Broadway as Billy Elliot. So you look at that and you think about, how is a kid supposed to get from North Bay, Ontario to Broadway being Billy Elliot without organizations, be it the schools, but ultimately funders, getting behind them? So there are individuals, there could have been corporations and all that. So I guess that's where I go to. It doesn't have to be an either or. And then I think that there needs to be a broader based strategy in terms of how do you want to develop. And I like what Sandy was referring to about the wellness. Because I think if we can get that conversation around explaining the benefit of the arts and why they deserve funding, to tie it in with health and wellness, I think then it's an easier conversation for people to understand. So I think you can kind of go in a lot of different directions, but I think it goes back to even my earlier comment about how do you just simplify the messaging and make it relatable.
Right. Can I just jump in on that? Another area to perhaps tackle is I equate it to, people think that the only thing we do at the bank is that there are bankers. People forget that in order to deliver all of the services that we are delivering, we actually need people who are in marketing, people who are in communications, people who are strategists and so forth. Actually the same in the arts sector. I think that there's a disservice that everybody thinks I'm going to get into the arts, but you immediately look at the product. You forget that there are numerous sectors of the economy that you are contributing to because you are producers, you hire CFOs, you have strategists, you have people who are in fundraising, you cross numerous parts of the economy through the arts. I don't think that story gets out, and I think that would be a very compelling way to also look at the value that you're creating. The other piece is we did a comprehensive review around what are the skills of the future in terms of a future economy. Just because we are really concerned about artificial intelligence, we are actually contributing to that because we're investing a significant amount. And the mapping ended up identifying that the really core skills for the future are create things that a artificial intelligence cannot do. So whether it be collaboration, critical thinking, leading with impact and influence. All of the key skills that I think the arts community can really contribute and shape and deliver for young people. So as they're navigating across the various arts organizations, you can also really contribute to skills that are actually required for the future. So somebody doesn't have to live and stay within the various arts pieces, but these are skills that allow them to be really successful moving forward. So again, what are the role of the arts sector to contribute to the skills that young people will need in the future? And then the last piece is that what we're finding in the Emerging Artists Program is that how can we help emerging artists build better networks? So what does a future leader in the arts look like? And we typically are funding things in a siloed way. So we would fund an emerging director, we would fund emerging filmmaker, we would fund emerging young people in terms of the performing arts or symphony. But the leaders of tomorrow, the leaders of your organizations, they need exposure in multitude of sectors of the arts. And how could we then collaborate in a way that would be much more innovative and create internships that would spend time in multitude of organizations? But the arts sector has to come together with the belief that in order for the arts sector to grow and prosper and be profitable and so forth, we actually this is what we need in terms of leadership. So how can the arts sector also help us? Is that our role as funders to identify these and bring it together? Is it our role as co-creators that if we all believe that this is what we need in terms of growing the future of the art world, we can do it together? So again, just kind of points to consider, because I do think that capturing that ambition allows funders to believe in that and to also join you in that journey.
Sandy, you're very involved in that work. I'm going to segue to a question around the project that you feel have had most impact, and I just wanted to have each of you talk about a project that you've funded recently where you have seen tremendous impact and where you're most proud. And then I just want to open up questions to the floor after that. So beginning with you, Sandy.
Well, I think maybe I'll build on Valerie's point, because one of the things that we've done for a long time is run an internship program for people coming into the performing arts. It's a program, actually the one we've run the longest. It's the best part of 20 years now. It's 250 to 300 people who've had an opportunity to make that crucial transition from being someone typically who's emerged out of school with a great desire to work in the arts and finding their way in. And what the foundation decided a long time ago was necessary was to create some kind of a bridge to ensure that there was an opportunity for that person to be mentored, to be paid, to be provided with the skills and attention and time necessary to qualify them to then take on a position in the performing arts world. And just to pick up on Valerie's point, I mean, it's extraordinary how little of that is available, not just in the arts sector, in the entire not-for-profit sector. The deliberate investment in professional development and in building bridges and arcs in the course of these people's career is so extraordinarily scarce. And yet I do think it's one of the most impactful things that we can do. And the consequences of that go on for the rest of that person's career. And we've now been at it long enough that we see, Metcalf interns are now running all sorts of arts organizations in Canada, and they're in the happy place where they're now taking on new Metcalf interns, which to me then becomes part of sort of a virtuous cycle, at least in a small way, from that bit of funding. But it would be awfully nice to see more of that, and more of it done in a deliberate way, and more thought all through the course of someone's engagement in the sector, in a world where you're not going to be paid very well, and where you're going to work very hard I think the least that we can do is think very deliberately about how we can sort of bolster and support you along the way, and how some of the resources that we're making available more generally can be targeted more particularly to the human beings who are doing everything that makes all of this possible. So it's not a specific thing, Nichole, but it's actually a cumulative thing that I think is one of the things we can point to as having been impactful.
It's great. Well, so often when you're doing a funding application, the guideline says, only 5% of this application should go to administration. It's called administration. Well, that's the person we need to hire to make sure this program runs well. And so somehow in the arts world, we're supposed to run our work without people, have the activity but without the people. And this is the bane of our executive director's existence. We need great people and we need to pay them, but it's very hard increasingly to find the funds. So it's really great that you're focused on this work. Valerie.
Well, I'm kind of the same as Sandy. I don't want to pick any of the favorite children in this regard. I think one thing that we're particularly excited about is, as we're talking about social impact and how do we actually help organizations better understand what that looks like and what that means from their organization, is allowing each of our investments allows a portion of that to actually go towards helping around the measurement piece, because I think it's important that any question that we ask around how is this program performing and are you meeting the requirements that we think are important, our challenge to ourselves is that answer needs to be as relevant to the organization. Like, the organization should care if their program is actually successful. So if we care about these specific outcomes, you should also care in terms of the way that you're delivering them, and you will learn through that process. Knowing that not all organizations are at the same level, what we're doing now is allowing organizations or providing funding for organizations to actually invest in their internal capacity so that they can be better prepared to measure that kind of information, and also perhaps secure additional funders because they've got a good handle on this is what works, this is what doesn't work, this is how we're actually delivering on our mandates. Then it allows us to be satisfied with the answer, but also adds value to the organization. And then if they're able to demonstrate and deliver that message in a compelling way, they could perhaps seek additional funding as well. So capacity building is really significant in that regard.
And with, I think it's 8,000 emerging artists who you have funded over the lifespan of the
yeah, to now and that's because we didn't count as well then. Then I would say every year now it's about 2,700 emerging artists that come through. It's 130 organizations. It's about $8 million a year. Another thing that is a bit of a pet peeve that I have is that many organizations we have limited access to some of the emerging artists that we support. And so, and by access I don't mean, I just mean it would be nice to be able to, even in some cases, know who they are, because we're very interested in creating alumni circles and ways for them to connect in a different way. Because the belief is, if you think about 2,700 artists that are perhaps at the same level, if they all know each other and then they're growing in their profession, then they'll meet a producer in this specific network, or they'll meet a dancer that they might showcase as they're growing and evolving. So the power of networks is going to be, I think, increasingly important, and the way that we could provide access to that or provide some infrastructure is something that we're also really looking at. So how do we build a cohesive network in that regard? But we need support and collaboration from many of the arts organizations that in some cases protect or want to keep apart some of the emerging artists that we're supporting. So I think it's a broader discussion around, it's not who owns that emerging artist, but how do we all collectively support emerging artists for the collective value that we're building.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And Naki, obviously you've just launched the strategy. I'm not going to ask you what impact you've had so far, but you did mention that there were projects and initiatives that have, this isn't sort of a brand new thing for TD. You have been obviously very invested as a bank in a lot of the arts projects. So is there one that sort of stands out? I mean, it's a two-part question. Okay. We're trying to get to an understanding of how our corporations who are moving more in this strategic direction of measuring social impact, what the metrics are. So what are you anticipating? How do you plan to measure success, I guess, of the investments that you're making?
Yes, it's a great question. I'm going to answer it, but I also want to refer back to some of the other points that were made earlier around excellence. You talked a little bit about supporting or funding excellence. I'm reminded of a quote from our former Governor General, Michaëlle Jean. She used to often say, art is an invitation to dialogue. And I think we understate the importance of art as a national conversation and the value of art as part of our national narrative. I think that is as important as any other metric or any other framework that we can talk about. If we think about how people have been excluded because their stories haven't been part of a national, their stories haven't been part of a national conversation, then you start to see how important the arts role is in terms of narrative and being part of that, telling those stories. And so when I think about the Ready Commitment and the fact that yes, it's an evolution, not a revolution, so we're not sort of starting from scratch. We have been part of investing in opportunities for narrative. And I would say that when we think about measurement, yes, we're not at a place where we've got specific metrics, but we are at a place where we are saying we want to look at short-term, medium-term, and long-term impact. And those three can be defined as lives touched, lives enhanced, and lives changed. So I'm not going to give you one project that I'm most proud of, but I'll give you three to illustrate the three examples. So from a lives touched perspective, within the Connected Communities driver, we have a sub-driver called New Narratives. And there we really want to focus in on, there are lots of narratives that are not new within the community that they come from. So there are many Indigenous stories that are not new. There are stories from the different ethno-cultural communities that are not new, but perhaps new to the broader mainstream. So we want to provide opportunities to really surface those stories and give them a larger platform. So a great example of that is an investment we made at the ROM, and Julie Crooks is here, so I want to shout her out. The Here We Are Here exhibit at the ROM that was really featuring the stories of Black Canadians, both historic and future-looking. I think it's a very powerful example of how you've got this important institution as the ROM providing space for these important stories to be told. A lives changed example, a lives enhanced example, I think come both in terms of the new acquisitions that we're making in our art collection, and one that I want to highlight is a piece by Jin-Mi Yoon, who is a Korean-Canadian artist, and she does a lot of paintings of landscapes, very reminiscent of landscape paintings that you would see, like Lauren Harris or any others. But in the middle of these pieces, she places herself. So it would be this landscape very much like what we see behind us, and there would be Jin-Mi in the middle. And it's telling the story of the immigrant body in the Canadian landscape. So from my perspective, being able to have that piece in a wealth office at TD and to have customers and colleagues see that piece, it creates an opportunity for dialogue. And in my view, that there's huge impact there around lives enhanced. And then from a lives changed perspective, very much in keeping with what both Sandy and Valerie have spoken about, we want to take, again, this interconnected approach. So for instance, we fund post-secondary institutions and provide support for bursaries. For example, we have bursaries to support Indigenous students. In some cases, those are Indigenous students who are pursuing a career in the arts. At the same time, we will fund internships or fellowships with organizations like the Power Plant or Canadian Art Magazine. In each case, we had a particular curator in residence as well as editor in residence opportunity that were specific for Indigenous populations. And so we know that from the perspective of developing a career in the arts, there are particular organizations that are recognized. And oftentimes, those organizations are not accessible to the very populations that they are trying to access in their audiences. And so through these kinds of investments, we're making those connections and building a pipeline of opportunity that ultimately will result in the transformation of that person's life, but also the transformation of that organization, as well as the communities that are touched both by the organization and from which that individual came.
Wonderful. So that frame again is wonderful in that it's broad and very flexible. So say it again. So it's lives changed.
Lives touched,
lives
enhanced, and lives changed. So short, medium, and long term.
That's good. Duane, I think I know the answer to your question in terms of, the best investment you've ever made has been this Canadian Arts Summit, right?
I was going to say, is that
right?
too obvious?
Here we are. Thank you. But really, I think we're gonna close on this. No pressure, and then we're gonna open to the floor. But is there an investment that particularly sort of made you feel proud of your contribution?
Yeah, and I don't think it's so. I mean, of course, it goes without saying that this is by far our best investment. No, all kidding aside, but I think I'll pick up on your comment about creating the dialogue, and it's not so much a direct investment, but I see it as a partnership. And on the examples I'll give are, I referenced earlier that, we have a number of clients that have entrusted us, to manage money for them, and so we feel strongly that to help, further, their profile and visibility is let's hold events at their facilities, or let's, sponsor an event or something. And I have to tell you, we've done this in a few spots. I mean, we're a national organization. We believe in being involved in local communities, and how many times we have done these various types of events where it can be just a simple wine and cheese, but you've got it at some place that has an art installation or something, gives people an opportunity to see something. And how many people in that local community might come out, and we've maybe perhaps helped bring them out, but have said, I've never been here before. Yeah. And then it creates that dialogue, and you just try and do that. So, I mean, it's certainly not at the point of how do we make a big investment in something, but it's how do we enable and further that conversation and dialogue.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great. How many times, Cornell, I love Tori's offices. It's just gorgeous art collection, and doing anything at Tori's is fabulous. It is a cultural experience. But how many times have we gone to a business environment, and I'm not picking on my husband's sector, finance, but the conference halls and the dreariness of the hotel conference halls when we have these incredible facilities. It blows my mind. Anyway, on to other questions from the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is great. I'm just curious, how do you calculate social return on investment within your different entities, or a social earnings ratio? And I mean, such a personal experience that people can have in terms of a transformational experience or an enhanced experience. And how do you capture all of that data to generate these types of reporting mechanisms that you shared as well, that go to the board and justify the value?
I can start. I think this is an absolute journey, and I think we have to also be careful that we don't get so caught up in the numbers that we lose all sense of what we're really trying to achieve. And if we fall too much in love with the solution and not necessarily the problem, then that leads us very much on that pathway. So we're also very cognizant around what I would call funder arrogance, where the funder thinks that they know the solution more than, in fact, the organization that is living it day to day. So we are really being deliberate in terms of what we're asking for. So on to be frank, to give you an example on this, the young people's, it's called RBC Future Launch. Our metric is we are looking to prepare 3 million young people for the future of work. So the word is prepare. So how do we help? How do we know if we're actually having prepared that young person for the future of work? Well, we're going to ask young people, so people who are going through programs that we are funding, get a pre and post assessment. They tell us, they provide the feedback on that. It's all kind of computer generated because they're doing surveys. All of the answers go back to the organization itself so that they can actually improve and better understand, gee, we were looking to do X, Y, Z. The young people are actually not achieving this. This is how we can actually improve it. So if you think about that multiplied by all the organizations that we're funding, we're going to look at creating some data sets that both the organization and then the sector more broadly can benefit from in terms of doing that. And then we'll be able to report back to the board and say, by the way, how are we on this trend, this journey around preparing young people for the future of work. We'll also be able to better understand what's in terms of the return. We're not at the stage where we can say this is the social return on our investment, but we'll be very clear to say this is the impact that we were looking to achieve, whether they be those social impacts associated as well with what would be the brand impacts that we're looking to define. What would be the employee impacts? Like, are there key metrics from our employee base that we were also looking to achieve? Were we able to demonstrate those as well? So that's how we're approaching that specific part, and very similar with respect to the Emerging Artists Program. I'm just talking on those two and not on the environmental piece, just because from point of view of examples. But on this one, it would be and it would be which parts of the how are we actually tracking and evaluating the artists as they're becoming more established. We're still trying to figure that out, to be frank. So initially, it would be in a very similar way, those artists that have gone through the Emerging Artists Program, what was the value that they had found through that program? I think more broadly, we need to define how can we continue to track that artist to define, are they actually now established? And so that's something that we're hoping to do, whether it be in discussions with the Metcalf Foundation and others around what does established actually mean, and what were the right levers in terms of getting that. Is mentorship more important than networks? Is it providing opportunities of actually getting more performance? Is it funding internships? There's so many different ways of actually getting to become established, so that we're just trying to, at this point, collect information about which ones have the most, I guess, impact, so that we can continue to fund those things in a greater way. So, not quite there yet, but I think it's a collective journey.
And I'll just quickly add to say, while we have the broad framework, sort of the short, medium, and long-term outcomes or impact that we're trying to measure, we're still in the process of distilling what specific metrics would be relevant per driver and with respect to which goal we're trying to achieve. And because we know that collecting data can place a burden on the organizations that we invest in, we're working with organizations to determine what makes the most sense in terms of data collection. So this is very much an early journey, and we recognize that it'll be quite iterative in this process. And we also recognize that there's going to be lots of opportunity for us to examine how we explore impact from a longitudinal perspective. Because for so long, much of our impact has been tabulated by how much money did we give to this organization and how many people came out to their event. And so it's quite a fundamental shift that we're embarking on, and I don't think that we're expecting that we'll have the answer tomorrow, but it'll be an exciting journey to work with organizations like yours on that.
So just one little bit on that, because this is a preoccupation on the funder side.
Yes.
I mean, I think, some things lend themselves better to quantification than others.
Yeah.
And so there's large pieces of our work where that's really not our emphasis, because it just isn't going to really get you where you need to go, and it's going to come at great, expense and irritation to all parties for what? So I think that for us at least, the sort of the qualitative inquiry as opposed to the quantitative inquiry can take you a long way. And because we work with probably fewer organizations for a longer period of time, we have the luxury of having we're on a journey with them. And a lot of what we're interested in when we're working with an organization is, what are you learning? And what are the implications of what you're learning for what you're doing? And what at the end of the day are we going to conclude in terms of the change that you've made in your path as a result of the work that we've done together? And I think that's significant. It doesn't translate into a set of numbers, but I think for a lot of what we're trying to do, the numbers sometimes are enormously helpful, but other times really not so much. So I think a lot of us are trying to figure out, what do we need to know, at what cost, to what end? And how can we lighten that burden and figure out the ways that give you the insight, both as a funder or as somebody who's actually doing the work, that's useful to you and gives you and allows you to do it better the next time, which is ultimately, I think, what we're trying to get to. So I think that's an ongoing conversation. We're not there yet, but it's an important one.
I think that's great, just from the perspective of all the small and mid-sized arts organizations that we work with through Arts Fest, which is thousands in this country. There are so few resources to do anything, and so to apply for the grant is one thing, is to do the evaluation is another, and so to layer on further for the large institution, one would argue it's easier in the sense that there's more resources at hand, but the amount of work, it's a very good consideration that you have.
I think that was the question.
And there was a question, sorry, I had the question in the back.
I just wanted to pick up on some of the things that Naki said in terms of having a broader conversation, exclusion, telling different stories, and the ethnocultural communities that make up this country, and also tie that into this morning's keynote about diversity of aesthetics. And given that we live in a country where historic inequities have led to a lack of organizations that are telling these diverse stories, we don't have an Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater in this country. We don't have a Chinese opera company in this country. So in these situations where there's this lack of organization, how do you move beyond this conversation around diversity and gestures and get to a place where you're supporting initiatives that are grounded in these diverse practices coming out of different communities, and get to a place where they're being advanced and those stories are having the opportunity to be heard without placing a burden on an opera company or a ballet company to take up those stories, because those stories are somebody else's to tell. And I know it's a big, huge question, but I'm wondering if there's been any thought might pop up.
That is a whole panel, right?
Another summit.
but just really quickly, I think it's a really complicated question because as we saw in the survey this morning, representation matters, and who is telling the story, who is making that invitation for dialogue matters. And I agree with you. I think it can be a challenge to place that expectation on an organization for whom there is no real interest or real aptitude to tell those stories. However, I do think that given the kind of country we say we are, we say we're a very diverse nation, we say that we believe in inclusion, I do think that there's an opportunity for organizations, whether they are focused on a particular ethnocultural group or ability group or any of these dimensions of difference. I think there's still a responsibility to include stories that have been traditionally othered. So I don't think that it would be a mistake. I don't think that it was a mistake for the ROM to say, let's focus on the stories of Black Canadians. As a Canadian institution, we should be telling all of these stories. And I think for the most part, most institutions most of the institutions that we're talking about do regard themselves as Canadian institutions. And so with that lens, there should be space for a multiplicity of Canadianness represented in those institutions. I think where there's an opportunity for us as funders is to support the development of new leadership. So I think that is where the opportunity for greater authenticity comes to bear. If those who are in the decision-making spaces can be reflective of the stories that are being told, I think we can get more authentic stories being told. And similarly, I think there's an opportunity, and I'm not saying, and this is me speaking personally, I think there's an opportunity for us to also challenge the boards of institutions as well, because the leadership, yes, it lives in the staff and administration, but I think there's also a place for the boards to be more reflective of Canada. And so I think together, volunteer leadership as well as paid staff, if we can see a shift in both of those areas, we're better able to make space for a multiplicity of Canadian stories.
We're definitely starting to ask those questions. Even it's interesting, you just asked the question around what's the board makeup and how does that board makeup reflect the audience that you're looking to serve. Just asking the question, I think, is already a start, just very similar to what we would ask if even our in procurement at RBC, I think it's similar in terms of TD, where just as a supplier to the organization, you ask the question in terms of if you want to be a supplier, can you just let us know about your board diversity and so forth. So I think if everybody just asks the question, it forces a reflection internally in terms of the organization, so that you can actually then move from asking to then saying that's a condition for funding. So first you have to progress on the journey.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could talk for a bit about impact, breadth of impact as opposed to depth of impact. I think what I'm hearing, and I think what I've experienced when raising money, is that it used to be that it was like number, Naki, or sort of short-term, number of people in the door, number of lives changed. And now I believe that it's shifting to sort of the depth of the impact with perhaps smaller groups of beneficiaries. Is that true? This is something I've struggled with when we have deeply impactful programs for 15 youth at risk that change their lives and give them new futures, but can't get money because it's 15 kids. So maybe just a commentary on that from any of you.
I don't think it's the intent, but I think it's a good observation. Like, are we so interested in the big number that at the end of the day we need to prove out that we've, prepared X number of, emerging artists and so forth, that we're looking for kind of the biggest bang for our buck, and we're not going to be funding smaller ones. So I don't think that's the intention, to be frank. And I would say, we support, it's 130 organizations was last year. The average number of emerging artists within each of those is 20. So again, the Emerging Artist Program, it's much more of a contained view in that regard. So it's not the intent, but it's certainly something that I would certainly take away and and look at that.
Okay, I think
nothing. I mean, just if I can just add one really quick thing. I think that I agree with you. I think that there is perhaps an inclination to look for the big numbers, and it comes from us too, right? As citizens, our reaction to big numbers is, wow, amazing, and less so when we hear, oh, these 15 people's lives have changed dramatically. I wonder if there's opportunity for us, as we look at the depth, the impact as it relates to depth, I'm going to harken back to an example in international development where we often hear that if you impact a woman in a village, you actually impact her entire village. And I think that parallel can be made in these instances where it is about life transformation, but for a small number of people. Yes, it might be 15 people, but each of those people perhaps has a partner, has children, is a mentor or can be a mentor. If we can embed within these programs that have a deep impact, but for small numbers of individuals, demonstration of how that individual has how the individual's life, how the transformation of that individual's life has ripple effects, I think that can speak volumes as well as we try to articulate the story of impact.
So we have time for one last question, and then we will adjourn. Yes.
Can you comment about regional decision making? Because at least three of your organizations are national, have offices in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Fundraising in Calgary, a common response is, that's a great idea, we really like it. Now we need to see if we can get approval from Toronto for a grant there. And it seems to me, when I've talked to some philanthropists, they say, we always want to give back where we make our money. And you have organizations that make money from one end of the country to the other. And I know you do have programs and you give grants out across the country. But what about that decision-making mechanism? Because I always believe that if you're making the decisions in the community where the activity is going to be happening, it's going to be a different type of decision than if it's being made, in a centralized location thousands of miles away.
Mm-hmm. So the way it works at the Royal Bank is if you take it's kind of a proportionate. So we would view it about 30% of the dollars that are driven around national programs, where in fact we actually need national scale to roll them out. And in rolling them out, they might actually have local value. And then the rest is actually divided by each of the provinces. So the provinces, there's a regional donations director that's there. We work very much together. So the application might go into what seems like a Toronto application. It gets quickly resent to the province. So in this case, if it would be Alberta, and the Alberta regional leader looks at that application, and then it gets invested in that specific province. So we disclose on a regular basis where the dollars go, so that it's actually proportionate to where, in fact, we earn our dollars across Canada. So we think it's really important to go back, just what you've said, and reinvest in that specific area. So it may seem like it goes to Toronto, but it quickly goes back to that specific province or territory.
Our model at TD is very similar. And within the Ready Commitment, we established a strategy that we believe can be locally applied, because we recognize the importance of the local nuance. And so even from a Connected Communities driver perspective, we know that issues around integration are different in Calgary as compared to Toronto. And because we're North American, we recognize the same would be true for Miami, where we have some of our offices, as compared to New York. So we've left space specifically for that kind of local interpretation of the strategy. Mm-hmm. And in preparing for the launch, we brought all of our regional managers together to really get trained on the strategy and to understand how it's meant to be applied, and then the room that's available for the local interpretation, or local application rather.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, and over to you, Robert.
May I begin by saying, wow. Wow. You, our panel, have been articulate, stimulating, and clearly caring individuals about our creative community. We're very fortunate to have such strong leaders as you on that side of the fence. The evolution of giving is something that is continuing. You've been helpful in giving us greater understanding of it. The word impact, I think, now has more meaning for all of us, and we thank you for that.